Vegetable gardening can be quite enjoyable. It can be quite productive, and it can be quite a challenge, especially when things don't go right. But knowing what could go wrong can help you have success. Join me today as I share with you 12 common mistakes with vegetable gardening. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and this is my primary vegetable garden. I say primary because I do vegetable gardening in other areas of my landscape. But when I first started doing vegetable gardening at this house about 3 years ago, it wasn't this big. And that leads to the very first mistake that's too common when gardeners begin growing vegetables. They start too big. I've been gardening for decades, and when I started this garden, I started with just 2 beds and some 5-gallon buckets so that I could figure out what my weather was like and how I was going to set up my garden. And gradually, over the last 3 years, I've added more beds as I figured out how to do it at this location, in this garden specifically. So when you begin your vegetable garden, don't start too big. Start relatively small. Figure out what you're doing, what you want to grow, and how to grow it. And maybe just a couple beds, and then expand as you develop more experience. In the second year, after those beds were completed and I had a full season of growing under my belt, I was ready to expand my garden. So I built some new beds, this area right here, which leads to the second common mistake, and that's choosing the wrong location. Now, we all know that you should have a lot of sun for your vegetable garden, and those beds and all of these beds do have full unobstructed sun. I did that on purpose. But when we choose the best location, there are a number of other factors to consider. How close is it to your house? How easy is it to access your garden? And things like water become particularly important. I have to have almost 100 feet of hose to reach this garden area. I would prefer to have something closer to the house, but this works best for me. Best for you might be something that you don't have to drag a hose around, something that you can just step out the back door and begin gardening. And I saw firsthand last season how the location and the water will influence what you grow. On this part of this garden area, I grew a lot of tomatoes. And then over here, I grew a lot of peppers. It was easy to bring the hose into this area, but in this back section, well, it became more difficult to bring the hose all the way back here. In fact, the hose was actually a little too short. So I grew pretty much nothing in this back section of the garden because the location was just too far away from my water source. I've already remedied that situation and got longer hoses, so I can now grow in all of my garden beds this year. It just goes to show that some of the things we don't think about really might have the biggest impact on whether we're growing at all. One of the things that we should definitely be thinking about right up front is our soil. One of the reasons that I started small and then gradually expanded my beds was because of the soil. I like raised bed gardening. I like bringing in good soil because my native soil is just extremely poor. By doing that, by focusing on the soil, you're setting yourself up for success. Most of the problems we're going to have with our plants in the garden, pests and disease, can be attributed to poor soil. Poor harvests can be attributed to poor soil. Poor plant health is almost always because of the soil. If you focus on the soil, because soil is key to gardening success, then you're more likely to have the harvests that you're looking for at the end of the season. A common mistake that new and experienced gardeners make all the time is planting at the wrong time. Every garden is unique, so you've got to figure out the best times for your specific garden. For me, in spring, it's a roller coaster. Today, it's supposed to be almost 85 degrees Fahrenheit in my garden, but less than a week ago, I had a foot of snow and temperatures were well below freezing. It would be very easy for me on this warm day to think, okay, it's time to get all my plants in the ground. But as I look to the forecast for the week ahead, I've got temperatures dropping close to freezing again. That's the kind of mistake that a lot of gardeners make. They see the plants being sold at the garden centers and they think that means you can put them into your garden. Or a warm day like this, you think, I'll just put my tomatoes and my peppers out, when the temperature of the soil may actually be too cool for some of those plants. As you understand what your plants need in the way of soil temperatures and air temperatures, it makes a huge difference in deciding the correct time to put them in your garden. The correct time for me to get this garlic in the ground was last autumn. Every plant has its correct time to be planted. And this beautiful garlic leads to the next common mistake, which is overcrowding. Just putting too many plants into a particular space. You have to anticipate the mature size of the plant. How big is it going to get? And then you sow the seeds or put the transplants into the ground accordingly. This garlic is all about 6 to 8 inches apart, measured so that I get maximum bulb development. If I put these any closer, I wouldn't get the garlic as big as I want it to be. And it's so common when we get a packet of seeds. There are so many seeds that we just want to grow everything. When you understand the correct spacing of your plants, you're going to have better harvests. When I'm asked about what the #1 mistake is that gardeners make, it's easy for me to answer. Incorrect watering. All of us do it. We have done it, we do it, and we will do it. We underwater or we overwater on a regular basis. And I think more plants die from our over and underwatering than any other factor. Way more than pests and disease. Because when a plant starts to look bad, the first thing we want to do is water it. That usually leads to overwatering. Or we know that overwatering is a problem, so we don't give it as much water as it needs. And if the soil doesn't have organic matter in it to hold moisture, then holding back on that water can be one of the worst things that we can do. I use my finger. I get down and physically check the soil moisture almost every time that I water. Now, honestly, I don't do it every time because I feel pretty good about how I water the garden. But even when I think I'm doing things right day after day, periodically, I still get in and check the soil moisture. The soil should be evenly moist, not saturated and not dry, particularly a few inches down where the roots are growing. Check your soil moisture and water when the soil needs it, and your plants will be better. One of the best things you can do to help maintain that soil moisture is to mulch your garden beds. And that leads to a very common mistake, which is not mulching enough. All of my vegetable garden beds have an organic mulch whenever I have plants in them. And I even have mulches on these beds when there are no plants growing. There are so many benefits to organic mulch. It benefits the soil and the soil microbes in so many ways. And by acting as a cover on the soil. It helps cut down on weeds and maintain that soil moisture level that we're looking for. I like to use straw, I like to use dried grass clippings, I like to use crushed leaves. And often I'll mix all three of those together as a mulch in my vegetable garden. It's one of the best things you can do for your plants. You should spend more time in your garden. A common mistake is not spending enough time in the garden. During the growing season, I'm out here every morning and every evening just taking a look at my garden, seeing what's happening. You can often see the pests arrive before they create a problem, and it might even influence how you garden. I was planning to cut the flower stalks off of this rhubarb a long time ago, but then I noticed they're covered with bees. And in my area, there aren't a lot of flowers at this time of year. The bees need food. So instead of cutting off the rhubarb flowers, I'm leaving them for the bees. If I didn't come out here to just observe, to soak in all the wonderful life in my garden, I might have missed out on this great opportunity, not only to help the bees, but to just watch them, because they're so fascinating and beautiful. A mistake I still continue to make is not harvesting when all the plants are ready to harvest. Right now, I have some chives, I have some horseradish, and I have some mint that are ready to harvest. Now, I just love gardening. I like growing the plants. I like building the garden, and sometimes harvesting just kind of slips my mind. But if you're growing for the purpose of harvesting, then by all means get out there and get that harvest. So many of the plants that we're growing, the peppers, the tomatoes, the cucumbers, the squashes, when you harvest the fruit, it's going to stimulate the plant to produce more fruit. So the way to get the biggest harvests is to harvest your crops as often as you can. Just don't forget to do it and become enthralled with just the beauty of the plants growing. A mistake I wish more gardeners would overcome is ignoring nature. We get focused on our vegetable garden and we think we're in control of everything. But as you saw with the bees, nature is all around us and they play an active role. For my vegetable garden, I'm growing this pollinator garden. These plants that I put in last year and are now coming back this year will flower and attract pollinators. And they'll attract beneficial insects that will help fight some of the pests. I consider this area part of my vegetable garden. Even though I won't be harvesting any of this to eat, it plays a critical role because nature, when you use it to your benefit in the vegetable garden, can really make it all much easier. A successful vegetable garden doesn't just happen. Building the beds, putting them in the right location, developing a good soil, thinking about nature, putting the plants in at the right time. All of these are important factors and they all require planning. And too many gardeners just don't plan the vegetable garden for success. You can just stick seeds in the ground and hope that they'll grow and get whatever harvest you want. But if you really want a successful vegetable garden, you need to plan for it. You need to learn about your garden and what you need to do specifically in your space to grow the best plants. Planning begins weeks, even months before the seeds and the plants go into the ground. So avoid that mistake of waiting to the last minute or just deciding on the fly what you're going to grow. Plan your garden and you can expect a successful garden. Some of us are lucky enough to live in areas where gardening is relatively easy. I gardened for a few years in California and quite literally grew watermelon plants from where my kids spit out the watermelon seeds months before. In Colorado, it's a little more challenging. It's a lot more challenging, and that leads to the next mistake. When confronted with the challenges of gardening, too many people give up. It's giving up before they become gardeners. Because when you become a gardener, you recognize that you can learn from everything that went wrong and get it right, or at least do it better the next time. By not giving up, by learning, and by trying harder, you can have more and more success. That's one of the reasons I love gardening, because it's so challenging. And I meet people in this area all the time when I talk to them about gardening, and so many of them say, "Oh, I tried that once," or "I tried that a couple years and it was just too hard." Yeah, it can be too hard, but you can do it. You can overcome the obstacles, and you can have that gardening success that you're looking for. And to help you figure out how to do it right, well, consider watching one of these videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.